already finished the presentation of the distinguished presenters. We have like 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions to the presenters, please.
Hi. African countries. Is there a way that they would have enough capacity to apply for these projects? I see that you are looking for projects that include resilience in all of its aspects, and they need to be complete projects. They need to consider different innovative ideas, etc., etc. But is there a way of working with them to do some capacity building so they know what is out there? What are the innovative? What are the new ideas? What are the kind of things that they can use to apply for this funding? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Colombia, please.
Thank you so much. Taking into account that the session also had a title on regulatory frameworks, I would like to ask if all this integration and like mainstreaming of climate resilience for infrastructure, how should it be regulated by governments besides standards and technical norms? And at least a recent debate that we are having in Colombia is, for example, should it be integrated into environmental license, all the adaptation and resilience consideration, or should it be managed like by another agency or unit, somebody that from the public side put the stamp that, okay, this has been considered resilience, or should it be something left to the market that some certification scheme is gonna take on and is gonna prove, yes, this is resilience? So how that regulatory framework, how did work that flow? Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a very important question because it also relates to how the GCF functions in evaluating the projects. Any other questions? Okay, I just have a couple of comments if I also add to the questions. And the GCF presentation, Mr. Dresden has mentioned a lot about the importance of the information and the modeling. We know that there is a body of work being done somewhere else. Under the WMO, you have the Global Framework for Climate Services, which in fact does most of what was mentioned here. And also there is, for the urban development, you have the new urban agenda, which is a part of the UN Habitat. So the idea I would think of is like, there is a need to bring all those elements together. So when you present a project as a country, you're having something that is very holistic. You're talking about disaster risk reduction. You're talking about the new urban agenda. You're talking about the SDGs. I see this as a trend which is gaining a lot of ground in the discussions in the GEF replenishment, for example, and in the discussion even most probably within other institutions. But still it hasn't matured enough within the GCF, where adaptation versus development is still like a big debate within the GCF, be it on the technical side or the board side. So from your point of view and experience on looking at those projects, do you think like is it possible to use the existing mechanisms, or we have to reinvent the wheel every time we have the GCF, so let's all go and have our own climate services without even referring to what is already in existence? I think this is one of the questions, and I mean, what our colleague from Colombia has mentioned is how can we change the mindset, not only through pushing or like putting standards for the banks, be it the FDB or the GCF, but also to make this the norm in doing business within the country. So things that are nationally funded, how can we make sure that there are standards and criteria and codes do apply the same standards that the banks are funding? Having said that, I will just stop there and give the floor to the speakers. I think there was a question to Mr. Timothy. And then the comments. So please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Capacity for government. As I indicated in the presentation, we actually have a systematic way of bringing up the government to integrate these measures. And this is not at the project stage. Way before the project, even at the conception stage, when the projects are on the master plan of the country. So if it's the water sector or transport or energy, we look at the sector plans, master plans of the country. Now, I also talked about the country strategy papers. The country strategy papers is also an avenue where we mainstream the country's own targets for its INDCs, costing those INDCs that they want to implement within the short term or the medium term time frame of their country strategy papers. So if, for example, we have Morocco having a target of, for mitigation, you could have specific targets because it's easier to quantify. But for adaptation, maybe they want to ensure that about 70% of the roads have good drainage systems. Or they want to ensure that all the energy facilities that are going to be built are built with climate resilient measures. This is part of the INDCs. So if we are having a country strategy engagement with them, these are incorporated in the strategy for the financing. So we don't really come when the project is to be prepared or it's at the conception stage. We also engage at the preparation stage, the design stage, and then the financing stage. And the question on regulation, I actually have a different perspective on this. Because, you know, if you are talking about environment impact assessment, there is one thing that we have to do is to differentiate between environmental impact assessment and climate change risk. Environmental impact assessment, on the one hand, is how the project will impact the environment. So biodiversity, habitat, and all that. Those ones we could regulate that don't destroy or degrade the forest. But climate resilient infrastructure is more investment to your own project, a risk to your own project investment. If you don't do it, you actually undermine the financial stability of your own projects. So for me, I don't really go for regulation, because you regulate something that the person sees that, oh, this is not in for my investment interest. But like I told you about the Interi Dam in Tanzania, if you didn't include the climate resilient measures, and now you cannot operate, it's a risk to your investment. If you build a road and you are having a toll on the road to use that cash flow to finance the money that you borrowed, and the road is inundated and nobody is passing and paying the toll, who is to be blamed? It's your own investment that is at risk. So, for me, I think for the win-win that is in, we could suggest some standards, some codes, some norms, but to really enforce that everybody should do this, I think if you are an investor and you're going to invest and you look at the risk and you still want to do that, it's up to you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add from the hydropower perspective is there are certain elements of climate risk that are already regulated. Dam safety is a non-issue. There's no looking at an incremental cost and deciding whether you want to spend it or not, the project must be safe. It cannot be built, and there are severe regulations and severe penalties if it's demonstrated not to be safe. At least in most of the developed world that I'm working in, and I may be speaking out of turn for some other countries where maybe the dam safety regulations aren't as stringent, but there are other elements of climate risk that are, we call them slower moving perhaps, variability of seasonal precipitation that is perhaps not something that has to be regulated, but must be considered when you're looking at a project. And it's in your best interest, as Timothy said, to look at that, but likely are not regulated. And it's different in every country. Every country will have its own set of stringent regulations, but it's evolving. I realize that there's no climate risk regulations in place specifically in the countries we worked in, but it's embedded in a lot of the processes that are there for the key elements like safety.
Okay. From GCS perspective, I think it's really important to try to understand what the national priorities for climate change are, whether they're coming from NDC on NAPs or any other documents, or whether they're coming from their consultation with GCF. That would then mean that the availability of WMO information is really regional and really not downscaled. And we see as a critical element that the countries have enabling climate service information system and early warning system that can really downscale climatic projections for a specific region in the country or specific city in the country. That's really important because then you can connect vulnerabilities on the ground and you can really create a climate finance case for whatever agenda you want to push. So it is closely connected to national priority and it's closely connected to what country really wants to do. So whether the country has a taste for a strong regulatory push, yes or no, that's a question of a country approach. But don't forget that the broader picture is that we need to use a lot of public money to get to the level of financing from private sector we need for climate finance. So I would always be on the side that in terms of creating enabling environment, in terms of creating the regulation that is going to push the events and service in the right direction, I think you need that push. The question is how long you need it, and that's something that is, again, determined at the level of the government. So I would say climate services and early warning system as one key element, some regulatory push in public sector money as a second key element, clear priorities of the country as the third element, and when you combine this together, then you probably have a mechanism that you can work on and use the existing climate finance architecture for the benefit of your country.
Thank you so much. I think in the course of the discussion, we have covered the first three questions, but nobody has touched upon the fourth one, which is the potential for using public-private partnerships to scale up climate-resilient infrastructure. So, but can I give you like 2 minutes each to just focus, like clearly focus, because the idea of mobilization of climate finance is different, of course, than providing climate finance. And the PPPs could be part, like people are saying that PPPs or BOTs are the ones, the way forward in providing this. So can I get just your views on this question for 2 minutes each? Thank you.
Well, I can only really go back to what I said about the hydropower preparation support facility. I do believe in the hydropower, and I'm speaking from the hydropower perspective. In the hydropower world, because of the upfront capital cost, the only way that private-public partnerships are going to likely begin to increase and get more private involvement is to remove that risk. In the absence of that, I don't see that there's going to be any major change. Hydropower projects are, by design, high upfront capital cost projects. There's very few that are not. So I think that's from my perspective how that can be incited, and I haven't really got another element to add to that right now.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, what we are doing is more in the area of project preparation. Because if you're able to de-risk, you're able to attract the private sector interest. So what we do is providing concessional financing for de-risking, and then also providing concessional financing for handling the incremental costs of the climate resilient measures. Now, we've actually been seeing a lot of private sector companies that are coming to partner with the bank because they know that the bank has the appetite and the capacity to absorb those risks. And sometimes, they want to undertake that project, but that's cost. It's affecting the project viability, and they think that the bank coming in will also have access to other international financing mechanisms like the GEF, which is managed internally, and of course the GCF. So we've been approaching it really from the project preparation facility angle.
Okay. Based on my experience as a banker for infrastructure, I would say that 80% of the PPPs are usually failing. PPPs can be successful in specific sectors of energy and specific sectors of transportation, but in other areas they're not very successful. So the PPP cannot be a silver bullet. It really depends on the case-by-case issues, countries and sectors on case-by-case basis. So I would not be very strongly supporting PPP as a solution, specifically not for climate-related financing.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all your inputs. Are there any other questions in the room? Any comments? Yes, I have two. Okay, please.
I had a question for the hydropower part. When we're talking about the climate resilient infrastructure, from all the presentation that I have seen, I already see the production part, means the power plants. What about the grid? And what are you doing, for example, for adaptation for the African Development Bank in giving the right education to those engineers to integrate the climate part in their work? Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Beatrice in the back. And that will be the last question.
A very short one. We know, of course, that GCF is not a bank. The GCF is an operating entity of the financial mechanism. And in fact, I was just wondering, the use of the word transformative, we know that we have taken it out in the transitional committee when we were looking at the governing instrument. It's nowhere in the governing instrument. I think that this is not a very useful term for the GCF to pursue using the word transformative, because that usually means that you are using your money to force the country to do something that they not necessarily would like to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I remember this. That was until the last evening of the transitional committee that this debate was on. So please.
Thank you very much for that question. You actually reminded me of something I had wanted to say and I forgot to say. If I had my presentation to do over again, I think I would have called it, what does a climate resilient hydro project look like, as opposed to talking about the guidelines, but I was asked to talk about the guidelines. Anyway, I absolutely agree with you. The climate resilience of a hydropower project has several elements. It's making sure the project is built in the right place. It's ensuring that it's safe and that it meets the energy production needs of the country and the utility, but it also needs to have strong interconnections. Every hydropower project is interconnected somehow, whether it's locally or whether it's connected through long-distance transmission. And more we're finding that long-distance transmission is a solution to climate resilience. And it doesn't sound like it fits, but it does, because where I come from in Canada, we had hydropower projects built in the northern part of Manitoba that can deliver hydropower to the southern region where the load is. But during a drought, we haven't got the capability to produce enough electricity. We have to import. So we import through a regional interconnection. And the question, of course, we've been asked by our regulator over and over was, what are you going to do if the drought is bigger than your design? We have to build another interconnection or build gas-fired plants beside it. But the preferred solution was we got another interconnection to the U.S., and that's our backup. And what you're seeing now in a lot of countries where they're considering the elements of long-distance transmission. But it's not only that, it's also protecting that transmission, so having redundancy in that transmission system, ensuring that if you're in a tornado zone, you don't lose all of your transmission in one place, you separate it so that there's space apart. And that is being considered in now that's an electricity grid question, not specific to hydropower, but it certainly is a resilience question for the power industry. So thank you very much for that question. That's a really good question.
Just in response to the capacity building for engineers, I just want to reiterate what Mohammed said. A lot of us who are here are policy and, I don't know, may I see by hand those who are engineers here? Yeah, engineers, okay. Okay, so we have engineers here. Okay, so this is part of the training. This is part of the exposure. But we realize that a lot of the issues, particularly in Africa, it's really circulating among institutions, and it's not getting to the people who are in charge of developing, designing the infrastructure projects. So that is why we did the capacity building, focusing on engineers, utility managers, so that they will also understand what is going on. Because they build the roads, they do the construction, they build the transmission lines. And if they know what needs to be done, I think, that is where the rubber meet the road. They are there, and they could ensure that it's done. And it will also make our work very easy. Because if they know what they do, the implementation gets down to them. So it makes the work very easy. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we ran out of time. I just want to add to last point because I'm ex-engineer in a previous life. So this is very important, and it's not only this kind of training and the idea of changing the mindset should not only come to engineers who are already in place, but also during the institutions themselves, the universities and the faculties, which is something that we need to work on. It is part of capacity building. It goes through education, but it is not yet very clear who can help countries, developing countries, do that. But having said that, I think we have 5 minutes for coffee until we have the coming session, the speakers to be on the table. So please help yourself. I think coffee and juice and some nice sweets are over there. And I think we should start in 5 minutes. Thank you.